Our first speaker today is Steve Heinke. Steve got his PhD from the University of Zurich in 2017. Currently, he's a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Psychology at the University of Basel. Steve mostly does his research in the fields of experimental and behavioral finance. Today, he'll be presenting us his study, This Time is Different, on similarity and risk-taking after experienced gains and losses. Steve, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay. So everyone should see now my screen. Thank you very much for this kind introduction and also for organizing this whole event to the organizers so that we can continue the research discussion. Also, thank you, Alex, for taking your time and volunteering to discuss this paper already, even though it's in a very preliminary draft. This project, as already mentioned, it's called This Time is Different, on similarity and risk-taking after experienced gains and losses. It's joint work together with Adrian Neuenberger, who has most credits for this work. He pushed it forward. Jörg and I, we guided him through this adventure, and we also got our hands a little bit dirty, but a lot of credits goes to Adrian. He's also in the chat, and as this, I might rush a little bit through this presentation. Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and he will answer them competently. So the starting point of this project is the observation that our risk-taking is affected by experience. We have evidence from the field, for example, the study from Namendi and Nagel, and also from the lab. Here, I just want to refer to the work of Kuhnen. And there are rational reasons why we should expect an experience effect. So there's learning involved, for example, in the field, as the environment is not fully described. But also there's information contained in experience. So usually asset prices, they reflect the valuation of others. So the change in the asset price gives you a reflection of a change in the valuation by other market participants. And of course, for field data, you might have a wealth and an income effect, and this will affect the resources you are able to invest to take risk. The underlying assumption in all these studies are that the type of experience is already known. So you take the MSCI World or the Dow Jones Industrial Average, or in the lab, it's even more obvious that you take a particular risky lottery or so. And so there's no questioning which type of experience. And that's what we do in our study. We go a step back and we ask, is it every prior outcome that matters, or which type of prior outcome matters for our actual risk-taking? And there are studies out there, and Alex has one study in the AR that ruled out learning and wealth channel explanation, but show that even if you let people live through the same experience, there are differences in the risk-taking. In the study of Alex, for example, there's a difference for people who experience the paper loss. So they are informed about the loss, but then they continue with the decision situation, versus a realized loss. In the lab experiment, there the experimenter took money away. And in the online study, which we will refer to, they are informed the whole process, how these losses will be now realized. And in this 2016 paper, it is referred to as the realization effect. So based on realization utility theory from Barbares and Xiong. However, in a replication attempt by Merkel et al., the realization explanation got challenged a little bit because they failed to, in the first attempt, they failed to replicate this realization effect. And then they looked a little bit closer and they found out that they didn't do, there wasn't a one-to-one replication. They called the last round additional round. And in the study of Alex, it's called period 1. Then they replicated the original study calling the last period 1. And then they found the realization effect. So kept everything different, the same. The difference is calling the last period additional round versus period 1. And we build up on this observation, and we think maybe it's not the realization effect. Probably it's the perceived distance between decision situations. So additional round makes the decision situation, the prior decision situations, appear closer to the last decision situation than calling it period 1. And going a step further, perceived distance is translated in the judgment and decision-making literature into similarity of situations or of events. And we argue similarity works here as an organizing principle that determines which prior outcome experience affects the current decision situation. And we will apply it to the framework of joint evaluation of prior outcomes with the current decisions. Our key results, which are in line with our theoretical framework and the pre-registration, is the less similar a prior decision situation in a task structure dimension, the weaker is the effect of the prior outcome. And we don't find an effect for variation in non-task structure dimension. So, for example, changing the background color, that's what we did. And that's also what we add to the literature and theoretical discussion is that not every change in each dimension is equally important. There are like relevance weighting. There's relevance weighting going on, and not every similarity change will lead to a change in the behavior. So we contribute to the literature of joint evaluation of prior outcomes. So for example, mental accounting, Gestalt psychology. I will not go into the detail, but what I want to highlight is that similarity in the discussion of economics gained recent interest. We have, for example, several papers that model memory formation. Put Gilboa-Schmeidler with their case-based reasoning into here, but also like the work from the team of Badalo and Schleifer, where they show that they can explain consumer biases, several types, with a memory model based on similarity. And Heinke, they have an application on this. Also, with the similarity modeling, you can explain categorization effects. And the paper that is closest to our is the other paper of Alex. It's the question about your preference to when you want to have like gains or losses separately in time, separated in time, or when you want to have them together. So it's a test of the hedonic editing hypothesis by modeling explicitly the mental account based on similarity. What we add to this discussion here again is that we argue, okay, similarity is relevant, but not similarity on each dimension. It has to be task structure relevant. Okay. We have a model about this, but due to time constraints, I will skip this model. So you can formalize this, and what I want you to take away is the following, that decision situations are perceived as less similar the larger the perceived distance of attributes of the decision situation. So calling the last decision situation period 1 makes the decision situation perceived less similar than calling it additional round. Or, that's the second case, and that's what I stressed already, the lower the relevance weight for these attributes with the last perceived distance. So changing the background color might be less relevant for the decision situation than how you call it, how you title the last round. And the less similar prior decision situation in the past, the lower or the weaker is the effect on the risk-taking, and thus the lower will be the risk-taking in T in the actual decision situation. This gives you a V-shaped function. So if you have on the x-axis the losses and the gains, and on the y-axis the risk-taking, it means the more you go into the extremes of the losses or into the gains, the higher will be the risk-taking. How do you test this? You need an experiment where you build up experience, and then where you have the ability to change certain aspects or attributes in the decision situation. We build on the study of Alex, and so it's 4 investment rounds. where you have in each round an endowment of 100 points. So in total, you have an endowment of 400 points. And in each round, you can decide how much of these 100 points you want to invest into a lottery. And the lottery works as follows. The participant is assigned a winning number, and the software then throws a virtual random die after your decision. And if the die displays the winning number, your investment into this lottery will be taken by 7, multiplied by 7. Otherwise, you get nothing. So it's a skewed lottery. And as we wanted to also replicate Merkel-Müller and Imas, we stick to this design. So this is how it looks like. That's actually the paper treatment of the study of Alex. You have round 1. So here you see the decision screens. So round 1, out of 2, round 2, 3. And then after round 3, you are informed about your gains and losses. And then you proceed to the last decision, where you decide how much you want to invest in the round 4. As all the situations are very similar, we call this our baseline. In the paper of Alex, it's called the paper treatment. And now what we do, we vary the similarity of the last decision situation to the first 3 ones. So first, we replicated the realization treatment in the online study of Alex, where people, after the first 3 rounds, were informed about their gains and losses, and then they were informed with the text how these gains and losses will be processed, put on a separate account, and once they read this, they had to type in close. And then they proceed to the last screen, and the last screen has the title period 1 now. That's why we call it realization and restart, but everything else is the same. So 2 things change compared to the baseline. You have to read the text, type in closed, and the last decision situation has the title period 1. We expect, due to this decrease in similarity, a less risk-taking in the last round compared to the baseline. Then we replicated the first attempt of Merkel-Müller, this replication. So again, you go through the first 3 steps, decisions, then you're informed about the gains and losses. You read the text about how these gains and losses will be proceeded. You type in closed, and the only thing that changes here is that the last decision is called additional round. So the only change from the treatment of Alex and Merkel is indeed the additional round title. And we expect, again, less risk-taking than in the baseline treatment, but we also hypothesize that this additional round treatment will make a closer link, so the perception of how close both these decisions are will be higher here compared to the study of Alex, and that the risk-taking will be higher in the additional round treatment. We added further treatments, so as also here, while reading the text and typing in closed, time passes, we decided to add a time delay treatment. So everything is the same as in the baseline, up to the point where you're informed about the gains and losses. Then the participant proceed to a screen where they are informed about that the experiment continues in 20 seconds. The 20 seconds is the average time the participants usually take to read the text and type in closed. So that's how we came up with this 20 seconds. And then they continue to the last screen, which is the same as in the baseline treatment, round 4 out of 4. So these 3 treatments we would call a change in the task structure. And now we changed something else. So we have like the same as in the baseline, but only the last decision screen. We flip the colors. We flip the colors to a gray background and a white screen. And everything else remains the same. But this change is a non-task structural change. So we hypothesize, or we expect that the risk-taking will be not affected compared to the baseline treatment. So how did we proceed it here? I don't want to go into every point here. I just want to highlight we run a power analysis based on the studies of Alex and Merkel-Müller, and we ended up with the number of 193 individuals per treatment. after exclusion, because we excluded all participants that invested below 5 points or above 95 points in the periods 1 to 3, because we wanted to avoid bottom or ceiling effects. Okay, then I continue to the results now. So the average amount invested is 40 to 45 points per round. And the average experience gain is 280 points, and the average experience loss is minus 116 points after the first 3 rounds. So this is the average number that people see before the last decision. Then we run a regression analysis where we took as an outcome variable the amount invested, and we separately looked for the loss domain and for the gain domain, how strong is the effect of the prior profits from periods 1 to 3. We separated between the loss and the gain domain because we expect like a V-shaped effect here. And for the loss domain, we find a highly significant and very steep curve. And for the gain domain, it's also a weakly significant effect and a less steeper curve. But also note that the range of the gains is way much larger, because if once you won, the amount will be taken multiplied by 7. So the range is way much larger of potential profits compared to the losses where the multiplier is only 1. So that's the takeaway. So profits affect your risk taking in the last decision situation. And this is the data only from the baseline treatment. And now we come to the treatment effects. I think this is the most important slide, and let me quickly walk you through. So for the baseline treatment, we observe, so here what we do here, we compare the amount invested in the last period less the average amount invested in periods 1 to 3 in points. And for the baseline treatment, what we observe is that the risk-taking is higher in the last round significantly, and by 6.4 points. And for the realization restart treatment, the risk-taking is lower than in the previous periods. So the risk-taking decreases. And this difference is significantly different, highly significantly different to the baseline treatment. And this is a direct replication of what has been found already in the study of Alex, which I don't think is a real surprise. We really stick to all the instructions and the experimental setup of it. But it's good that we replicated this finding, I think. Then for the additional round treatment, so here in the last period was called additional round compared to the restart treatment where it was called period 1. So we don't find a change compared to the risk-taking in the previous rounds. But we find a treatment effect, a highly significant treatment effect compared to the baseline. So obviously the perceived distance is larger for the additional round. And we also find that the risk-taking is larger compared to the restart treatment, where we call it the last round period 1 compared to the additional round here. Coming now to the time delay treatment, again, let me replicate this, is where you have to wait 20 seconds till you proceed to the last decision. We observe significantly, or weakly significantly, higher investment amounts compared to the first 3 rounds. And compared to the baseline treatment, we observe a weakly significant reduction in the treatment. So the effects are less stronger than in the other treatments, but note that this time delay treatment, the only change was that we took the average time that it took the people to read the text and type and close. And here the average and median, they are very close together. So the time, so for some people, it would have been better if they could have longer time, and then would have waited longer time, and then we would be probably closer to the other treatments. But nevertheless, there is an effect of time delay. And For the layout treatment where we change the background color, we find that people significantly invest more compared to the rounds before. And we don't find a treatment effect between the baseline treatment and the treatment where we change the background color. This is of particular interest as this is the treatment that was most recognized. So we asked the individuals or participants afterwards about how much they recognized the treatment. And so this is, here you see the percentage of correct recognize the treatment they are in. And you see that the layout treatment, so they recognize with, and most of the people saw that it was a gray background. And for those treatments with the strongest effects, we have the least recognition, correct recognition of this. Okay, due to time's constraints, I will skip this covariate change. The only thing we want to say is here probably that all treatment effects remain qualitatively the same if we include all the covariates potential and that they don't alter our effects. The conclusion is, even if you don't believe in the similarity argument, it's a direct replication of the study of Alex, and also a partial replication of the findings of Merkel et al. And what we think our main finding is aligned with the proposed theory. A decrease in similarity of the task structure reduces gambling for resurrection and house money effect, and a reduction in the perceptual dimension is recognized, but does not affect risk-taking behavior. As an outlook, we think similarity as an organizing principle for experience-based learning, belief formation, and evaluation is a promising field to go on. And we also think that's good news for experimental design considerations, that you only have to worry about task structure changes rather than which color your experiment is in, as long as you don't do perceptual tasks. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for taking too much time.
Thank you very much, Steve. Now we'll have Alex Imas from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He'll discuss this paper for us.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so thanks a lot for having me and organizing this. Thank you, Steve, for writing this paper. I really enjoyed reading it. The theory is really interesting conceptually and makes a ton of new predictions for risky choice. I think some of which you explored in the paper, but I found the theoretical model to be very exciting in general. I think you spent a lot of time in the presentation more on you know, the Barbaras et al. Dynamic risky choice part of it, but the model in the paper, for those interested, actually includes a lot of super interesting stuff related to how similarity is processed and actually modeling this mathematically, which is really exciting, but you know, limited time, you weren't able to get into that. And I thought the experiments were carefully done, pre-registered, yeah, everything. I don't have too many comments on that. The first thing that I wanted to start with is that this is a really great example of cumulative research. My original paper on realization effect was actually a direct replication of prior work. So the physical realization treatments were actually a replication of other people who were either physically or not physically realizing outcomes. And what I did was to replicate their results and make a conceptual point that, look, this actually matters. This paper is very much in the same spirit. It replicates prior work, my own and Merkel et al.'s, and in doing so, it makes a deep conceptual point, which is, look, the prior work has really been focusing on this, you know, kind of transfer realization mechanism, but the underlying important mechanism is not this physical or transfer element. It's really similarity, which is awesome in my opinion. And as a kind of a side note, I'd like to say that since this is a junior experimental conference, I really like the fact that I'm a big proponent of posting your instructions and posting your data and things like that. This allows these sort of papers to come about. So this is a replication. There have been other replications of my work and other people. And in my view, this sort of cumulative approach, which includes Kirby Nielsen has a nice paper on realization effect too, where papers build directly on prior work, and these papers are rewarded by getting published. and include direct replications. This is one of the big strengths of economics, in my view, is both an empirical and a theoretical science. So this is just a broader note. More to the paper, I thought the theory was very interesting. I think what would be really nice to include is another direct test of the similarity part of the theory, applying it to risky choice. Perhaps this would use a different paradigm than the Gnesi-Potters, because in the similarity paper that I have with Ellen Evers, perceived similarity is manipulated, and the main dependent variable is when do you want to experience outcomes. For example, one of the experiments we have is you have 2 bad outcomes in different classes in school. This is a hypothetical survey. And this is either presented as part of school-related outcomes or different classes. And the question is, when do you want to experience these things? And despite the fact that these are the same 2 outcomes, when they're presented as school, people want to experience them at the same time. When they're presented as classes, people want to experience them in different times. Obviously, this is nothing to do with risky choice. So one thing that the paper could do is either manipulate similarity and risky choice differently and still look at risk taking. So for example, keep the last round the same, but saying, look, this is the same lottery, or saying this is a new lottery or something like that, which is very similar to what they did. Or you could manipulate similarity in the same way that they already do, which is round 1 versus additional round, and look at the timing of outcomes. When do people actually either want to make the decision or learn about the outcome of the decision? The other things that I wanted to quickly note is that the authors focus on non-physical realization conditions, where realization truly is just a matter of framing. I think it would be useful in the paper to talk about the physical realization aspects of the original papers as well, because those have been widely replicated. Even before my paper, there's a lot of research on this. And so I think their theory could actually shed a lot of light on this too. I don't think they need to run new experiments, but I think a discussion of how physical realization relates to similarity would be useful as well. On the point of the theory, I think they use Steve didn't have time to get into this, they use the Barbaras 2001 model, which is also used in the Merkel paper. But a lot of the recent work on dynamic risk-taking uses a forward-looking model that generates dynamic inconsistency. I think it would be useful for this sort of paper to broaden the scope of the predictions, and they might want to use the Barbaras 2012 model, which generates dynamic inconsistency as well. It's more forward-looking. You can think about how similarity affects forward-looking plans and so forth. And then I have just tiny notes on interpretation. I'm fully on board on similarity being the underlying process explaining, the realization effects and all of that stuff. But the authors note that realizing gains and losses cannot fully explain the joint evaluation. I think what my reading of the paper is that that's not quite right. What they're trying to argue is that realization changes perceived similarity. And so realization does explain the results in a kind of a reduced form manner, but similarity is the underlying important mechanism. That's the portable takeaway from these papers rather than realization. And the last thing I would want to note is that I would have liked, at least in the paper, to see a closer link to mental accounting, in the sense that the authors note that they're not really addressing mental accounting, but implicitly the entire paper is about mental accounting in some ways. Because really joint versus separate evaluation, this is mental accounting. Some people call it bracketing, some people call it framing, but it's mental accounting in the sense that things that are in the same mental account are evaluated jointly, things that are in different accounts are evaluated separately. So either take out that sentence, that's perfectly fine too, or kind of include a deeper kind of conversation about mental accounting and how it relates to this work. But yeah, that's all I have. So thanks a lot for writing this paper. I'm really excited by it. And thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex.
So we have maybe 30 seconds if you would like to respond, Steve. If not, we can move to the second talk and we'll have the questions at the end.
I totally agree with what Alex said. This whole topic about mental accounting is on our topic list, and I would be happy to discuss a little bit later on about this, and happy to hear about Tomáš' work.
Wonderful. So I'm happy to present our next speaker for today. who is Tomáš Jagelka. He's a postdoc researcher currently at the University of Bonn and received his PhD from École Polytechnique in 2019. One of his current research focuses is on using structural econometrics methods to improve measures of economic preferences. And today we'll hear about his ongoing work on separating true preferences from noise and endogenous effort in observed decisions. So Tomáš, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction, Ian, and thank you all for having me. Today, I will present to you a joint paper with my co-author, Christian Basel, from École Polytechnique. The paper is titled Separating True Preferences from Noise and Endogenous Effort. The main question which we try to answer here is whether the modeling the decision to exert effort can help us evaluate the noise content of commonly used experimental task designs for eliciting risk preferences and to debias estimates. Our work adds to a couple of different strands of the literature. The first one is concerned with estimating economic primitives predictive of outcomes, such as economic preferences in this case. The second one, and this is a growing field, is concerned with separating signal from noise, whether it be in real world or experimental decisions. Finally, we add to the literature on behavioral and attention, summarized by Gabay 2019, which includes concepts such as rational inattention, rational imprecision, and limited attention. Here we use data from the Millennium Foundation field experiment on education financing, which includes a representative sample of over 1,200 Canadian high school seniors. The experiment is relevant for our purposes as it includes 55 incentivized choice tasks, which each student had to make choices on, designed to elicit risk preferences, and crucially, these tasks are of two different designs which were commonly used in the literature previously. 30 of the tasks are of what I'll call the HL design, following Holt and Laurie 2002, and 25 are of the binarized OLS design, following Binswanger 1980, popularized by Eckel and Grossman 2002 and 2008, and used in this form by Engel, Varnick, and Escobar in 2006. Here's an example of tasks of the HL design. These tasks come in groups, or what is referred to in the experimental literature as multiple price lists, or MPLs. This is an example of the first, second, and last task in one of the groups of tasks of the HL design. Now, I would argue that this particular design is intuitive and provides a simple setting for eliciting risk preferences. And there's a couple of features which I would like to point out. First of all, you may notice that the choices involve a choice between a safer lottery, which is on the left, and a riskier lottery on the right. The safer lottery offers either $30 or $24, whereas the riskier lottery offers either $60 or $1. Now, one of the interesting things here is that in the first row, the safer lottery is actually very attractive. In fact, the expected value is higher than that of the riskier lottery, which makes this a rather simple choice for most individuals. Only risk-seeking individuals would be expected to choose the riskier lottery on the first task. Now, as you proceed down the set of tasks, the attractiveness, the relative attractiveness of the risky option is increasing, and this is done in a way which is clearly visible to most individuals. As we get to the last option, we actually have a dominated choice because the larger payment here is received with certainty. Now, it has been shown that even on repeated elicitation in an experimental context in controlled conditions, individuals make inconsistent choices. This has been shown in previous research, and we documented in this work also. Here is one measure, one possible measure of choice inconsistency, which measures the number of reversals and choices exhibited by individuals. And what I mean by a reversal is that assume that an individual started safe in a group of tasks, such as what I presented. Then he switched to the riskier alternative once that became sufficiently attractive to him, only to go back to the safer option, even though the riskier option became even more attractive within the same group of tasks. This is a reversal. It is actually evidence of quite a strong form of choice inconsistency, and it is exhibited by approximately 2/3 of the population here, with many individuals making more than one reversal. Now, the interesting thing is that if you dig deeper and you look at reversals by task design, you'll notice that a vast majority of them are concentrated on the OLS design. And this motivates the analysis, which I'll present to you now, where we endogenize individuals' choice inconsistency as a function of task parameters. So what makes the OLS design different? You'll see that on a first look, it looks similar. The graphical design is similar. However, the features which I've highlighted with the OLS design and as making it particularly intuitive are lacking. Notably, there are no easy choices. So there are no safe options where the expected value is actually higher than the risky option. And there are no dominated options. In addition, while this also is an ordered list, and these questions do come in groups, the progression is much less visible. Indeed, I had to do the calculation myself to see that the riskier alternative is becoming less attractive as you go down these tasks. This increases the cognitive load associated with making any given task, one might argue. This brings me to a chart from a forthcoming chapter with Jim Heckman and Tim Kautz, where we argue that any choice, it could be in an experimental setting or even on qualitative indicators, is really reflective of a number of skills, preferences, and crucially effort. And this brings me to the model which we employ here, which we decompose into 2 stages. In the first stage, an individual decides whether or not he wants to exert effort on a particular task that he's facing. In the second stage, he makes a choice. And if he chose to exert effort, then he'll make a choice according to expected utility based on latent risk preference. And if he chose not to exert effort, he'll choose according to some randomization strategy or heuristic. I will now present the first stage of the model in more detail, because this is really the main contribution of the paper. We assume that when an individual comes to a choice task, he gleans the information which is readily and effortlessly available to him on that task. This will be notably information on the costs and benefits of exerting sufficient effort, where we define sufficient effort as the effort necessary to be able to choose the expected utility maximizing alternative given a risk preference. To this end, we first define a benefit function for individual I, which converts the readily and apparently available characteristics of task L, PL, into a felicity level. One might assume that the benefit function would be increasing in the relative stakes of picking one versus the other alternative, which is simply the opportunity cost of making a wrong choice, the cost of making a mistake. We write the benefit function as follows, where we allow it to depend on an individual specific intercept, on a vector of coefficients, which reflects the weight the individual places on each readily available characteristic in PL, and which includes a random shock realized before an individual evaluates the benefit of exerting effort on the particular choice task. Similarly, we define a cost function, which captures the individual's disutility from exerting sufficient effort on choice task L. This might be assumed to be increasing in the amount of effort required to choose correctly, and also increasing the fatigue for a given level of effort, which basically allows us to say, or to allow for the possibility that a given unit of effort becomes more costly as an individual gets more tired. We write the cost function analogously. We allow it to depend on an individual specific intercept, on a vector of coefficients, any vector of readily available lottery characteristics. Then we tag on an error term. We make a couple more assumptions. We assume that the agent acts according to net benefits, that effort is indivisible, which simply means that the individual will either exert no effort, or if he chooses to exert effort, he will exert the amount of effort necessary for him to be able to choose according to expected utility. Finally, we assume that the difference between the two error shocks follows a standard normal distribution. We can then define the probability that individual I exerts effort when faced with choice task L simply as a function of the readily available characteristics of the task. In the second stage, where the individual is actually making a choice, if the individual exerts effort, he will select the alternative, which gives him higher expected utility. Now, we also allow for randomness in the second stage, which I will skip for now, as that is not the main contribution of this paper. It was used in previous research, and I will come back to it when I talk about the results. If an individual chooses not to exert effort, he simply selects an alternative using some sort of a heuristic. All right, so we can combine the two stages to obtain the probability that individual I actually chooses the riskier option, Y on lottery choice task L, which is simply the probability that he prefers the riskier option and he exerts effort, plus the probability that he does not exert effort, times the heuristic, which is captured in the probability with which he selects the risky option when he is randomizing. In the baseline specification, we assume this is 0.5. So if the individual does not exert effort, he chooses randomly between the two options with equal probability. And they say robustness check, we estimate PY, and we find it for the mean and the median individual, this is actually not that different from 0.5. So the objective function, finally, to be maximized is the probability of jointly observing the individual's 55 decisions on the experimental tasks. Now we're getting to the results. Here you can see estimated distributions of risk aversion and of individuals' probability of exerting effort. These are individual point estimates. We do the estimation individual by individual. In the first column, you can see estimates coming from all the tasks. In the second column, only those of the HL design, and in the third column, tasks of the OLS design. There's a couple of things which I would like to point out here. First of all, in this instance, we do not allow the decision to exert effort to depend on task parameters, so only design by virtue of including tasks of one or the other design in the second and third column, which allows this result to be compared to previous results in the literature, which assumed an exogenous mistake probability or a trembling hand parameter. What you'll notice here is that the median level of the estimated coefficient of relative risk aversion, we assume CRA utility here, is quite similar independent of the design. And this corroborates insights from previous research, such as Harrison and Rudstrom 2008, who found that the HL and OLS designs seem to be measuring the same underlying preference. However, where the differences really emerge is in the estimated probability that individuals exert sufficient effort on the task. You'll see that on the HL design, this is pretty much equal to 1 or 100%, whereas on the OLS design, the mean and median individual are estimated not to exert effort approximately a quarter of the time. This leads to the second exercise which we conduct, which is estimating the model without the effort parameter. And unsurprisingly, on the HL design, the estimated distribution of the coefficient of risk aversion is virtually unaffected. However, on the OLS design, not taking into account the decision to exert effort produces estimates of risk aversion biased up to 50%. And this, by the way, disappears once we incorporate the full model, where we allow endogenous effort to be a function of the readily available characteristics which an individual uses or can use to estimate the net benefits of exerting effort. All right, so here are some results from the full model. We find that the probability of exerting sufficient effort is increasing in the relative stakes of making a choice, which we proxy for here simply as the difference in expected values between the safer and riskier lottery in any given task. We also find that the probability of exerting effort is decreasing in task complexity, proxied for here by the task design, and in an individual's fatigue, proxied for here, again, by task order. For the median individual, we find that the marginal effect, averaged across all tasks, of switching from the more complex OLS design to the more intuitive HL design leads to a 30% increase in the predicted probability of exerting effort. We estimate the additional effort cost imposed by the more complex design at $1 per task. We also find that increasing relative stakes by 1 standard deviation leads to a 7% increase in individuals' probability of exerting effort, whereas increasing fatigue by a standard deviation leads to a 2% decrease in individuals' effort probability. Now I'll get to the second stage in a little more depth. We also allow for randomness to be incorporated there. This is the standard way which it was done before in structural research on preferences. And one way is what is referred to as the random utility model, where the error term is appended to the difference in expected utilities of the two lotteries. And this is the model which was used overwhelmingly in previous research. Now there is an alternative, which is the random preference model, due to my esteemed discussant, Bob Sugden here, in Looms and Sugden 1995, where the error term is added onto the preference parameter itself, the risk aversion, making it a random variable. There's a recent JPE paper in 2018 by Apostego and Ballister, where they show that the random utility model applied to standard utility functions such as the CRA or CARA violates basic theoretical conditions which one would like to see in a model of decisions under risk, notably monotonicity. And what I mean by monotonicity is that you would want a model which, if you have a more risk-averse individual, it would predict that he would be less likely to choose the riskier of two alternatives than a less risk-averse individual. This condition, unfortunately, is violated by the REM, but satisfied by the RPM. Furthermore, Apostego and Ballister documented the REM overestimates risk aversion compared to RPM estimates by 14%. We replicate this finding when we ignore the first stage effort decision and find that overestimation is actually equal to 23%. And crucially, we find that it disappears when endogenous effort is incorporated, which suggests to us that at least in this experimental context, modeling the first stage effort decision is empirically more relevant than where the error term is placed. I will conclude by showing you the fit of our model, and notably the predicted power of the estimated structural parameters on the number of safe choices that an individual makes and on the number of reversals he exhibits. You'll see that on the HL tasks, the structural parameters of our model explain choices very well, to the order of 90%, that's R squared, and pretty much all of it goes to the preference parameter, the coefficient of risk aversion. On OLS tasks, both the R squared is lower, and crucially, the explained variation, half of it goes to the coefficient of risk aversion, the preference parameter, and half goes to differences in the estimated parameters governing choice inconsistency, notably effort. This suggests, again, confirms what I told you before, that the OLS design is much more noisy, even though it seems to reflect the same set of preferences. Finally, when you look at reversals, those are almost entirely explained by differences in effort probability. In summary, we propose a two-stage decision model with endogenous effort and show that it can be used to evaluate the noise content of different experimental designs and to debias estimates. We show that commonly used task designs for eliciting risk preferences measure the same latent preference, but reflect varying amounts of noise. The omission of the effort decision can result in estimates biased up to 50% on the noisier design. Our model has high internal validity and allows for the evaluation of the cost of attention. And modeling endogenous effort empirically in this context turns out to be more important than where the error term is placed. I would conclude by saying that good experimental design can substitute for structural econometrics, but it is risky to rely on it alone. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that very interesting presentation, Tomáš. We'll now turn to Bob Sugden for discussion. Bob?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I thought it was a very, very clear presentation. I was intrigued when I was asked at the last minute to discuss this because of two things about it. One was that, well, two conflict between things. That on the one hand, it was going to be about true preferences and also going to be about the random preference model. And in my two things that I'm really keen on, one, I'm very, very keen on the random preference model. I'm also extremely unkeen on the concept of true preferences. And when Graham Looms and I developed the random preference model, actually, I think our reason for wanting to have that model was precisely because we wanted a model that didn't have true preferences. We thought what was wrong with the random utility model was that it had true preferences plus error. And we said, what would the world be like if there was no such thing as true preferences? Anyway, let me proceed. I hope I can share my screen. I think I can. Oh, can I? It says I cannot share my screen while the other participant is sharing, but can you?
Oh, I apologize. This should work now.
Okay, see if this works now. Oh dear, wait a minute, just a second. Yes, that's right. Slideshow. Yes, okay. Well, this is you've already seen. What I was interested in, I mean, I'm not an econometrician at all, but the thing that struck me was the difference between these two methods of eliciting attitudes to risk. And if you think about these two methods, it seems as though they're at the level of the individual choice, they're very, very similar. They've got you're given two lotteries, each of which has got two consequences. There are 4 consequences in all. You have to choose one of them. And you have a series of choices. There's a structure to the series of choices that the experimenter knows about. And the structure is basically that if someone was an expected utility maximizer with constant relative risk aversion, as you go down it, they would switch from safe to risk off and risk to safe. And so this is here's the whole lorry picture you've already seen, and here's the Binswanger OLS system. And one thing that, although Thomas didn't notice, but didn't refer to.
Sorry to interrupt you, Bob. We actually can't see the slides that you're referring to right now.
That's right. Yes, I know you should be. You can see them.
We cannot.
You cannot.
Right.
How's that? Let me just see why is that not? Go to Zoom. No, Zoom webinar. I should share my screen. What are you seeing when I share my screen? I'm supposed to be sharing my screen now, and I'm supposed to be. Can you not see a slideshow?
No, not right now.
Why is that?
If you click on share screen, it will give you some options if you want
Sorry?
to share.
It says share screen, so I click on share screen.
And then you'll select the document that you would like to share. There's going to be a pop-up screen. Just select the document that you would like to share.
Oh, I see. This is it. Sorry, is that now okay?
Yes.
There we go. Yep.
Okay, right. Sorry, I see. I understand how to do it. So I'll just put onto slideshow. Sorry about that. I'm not very good at this. And so in the Binswanger design, what you're doing is you start off with a situation where there's the safe option. The risky option is really quite attractive. If you take the risky option, and then next stage round you're offered an even riskier option, and you take that and you're offered an even riskier option. So anyway, the point about this, it seems to me, is that these two designs are very similar in intent. The aim is to pick up the risk aversion parameter of a subject. It's always a binary lottery. But what the experiment is reporting is that the MPL design induces much more consistency than the OLS. Question is, why is that? the proximate explanation that Thomas is offering seems to be entirely right. It's that although the individual problems are of similar complexity, the relationship between the successive problems is more transparent in the MPL. Or in other words, once you've answered one question on the MPL, you more or less nudged, as you've put it in the paper, you nudge towards you. It's fairly obvious what to say next. So once you've answered one question, you know what to say on the, oh, not quite, but it's easy to answer the following ones. Now, the question is, how do you interpret that fact? Your interpretation is true preferences, imperfect self-knowledge that somehow people don't really know their true preferences, but they have them, and it requires cognitive effort to retrieve them, and there's a rational and attention problem that you're rationally choosing how much effort to put into retrieving your true preferences. Right. And it seems to me there's a much simpler explanation for this, which is that it's similar to the sort of coherent arbitrariness explanation. You say, once you've chosen, you don't, I mean, it's always puzzled, well, not puzzled me, it always surprises me that when we put all this effort in the early years of behavioral economics to establishing that people weren't rational, and then we end up having more and more sophisticated, ultra-rational, meta-rational. So this is a meta-rational theory that's being offered now of people who are aware of their irrationality, but can cope, but make a rational choice about how irrational to be or whatever. Anyway, a simpler explanation seems to me that if you have a design where once you've made one choice, the next choice is implied by it, then it's kind of self-evident that you're bound to be, well, bound to be, highly probably you're going to be consistent. And it's not consistent with your true preferences, it's consistent with your first preference. And that would be compatible with the thought that both of these methods are picking up much the same underlying distribution of preference, because the choice problem that people are facing is very, I mean, the single choice problem is very similar in both cases. So that they're being, what you're tapping into at a single choice problem is similar, but the difference is whether once you've made one choice, you're encouraged to give the same answer over and over again. And so it seems as though instead of thinking about it as, here's my conclusion. If what you're thinking about is you're wanting a single measure of risk attitude as an add-on to an existing experiment, which is de rigueur these days. So I'm running an experiment. I must find out all these things about my subjects. And so one of them, oh, throw in a Holt lorry test, you know, just throw in the kitchen sink. And if you want to produce a measure that is easy to ask, the subjects can answer very quickly, and it produces a measure that's consistent with EU, then the Holt lorry is a really good one to use. But if you're interested in what people's true preferences are, it seems to me that isn't the way to go. And back in the 80s, when we were first running experiments to investigate choice and answer, we thought the exact opposite. We thought that well, ideally, the bottom line would have been ask each person a single question, but that was not very practical. But what we would do is we'd say, ask people a very small number of questions, incentivize them reasonably well with your random lottery incentive system, make sure that they can't see the connection between the questions. So you try to make them, you put them in random order, you look at the question, and then what you want them to do is to give all their attention to a single question intuitively, not looking at the numbers and the probabilities so much as getting a feel for it, thinking of it as a genuine choice under uncertainty. And we always felt that the more choice problems you put in your experiment, it's not that people rationally gave inattention, it's just that they psychologically, you couldn't continue to get a feel for the risk. So you're wanting people to have a feel for it as a risky choice. The way to get them a feel for it is give them very few questions and don't connect them together. And when we do that, what we found was that people were very inconsistent. I mean, you asked them the same question twice. They were clearly attending to the questions. Well, I'd say clearly. You felt it. We used to do this experiment. We actually went with the people. We could see them doing it. who could see they were attending to them quite seriously. They cared about the money, and you gave them the same question twice, and 25 to 30% of the time they gave different answers. So it seemed to us that it's not the basic point is that true preferences just are stochastically varying, you know, and it's not. And I think that this whole strategy of trying to, really the whole strategy of trying to elicit, assuming that people have got preferences that are EU, that these are true preferences that you can discover, I think is a mistake. Anyway, let's stop there. Sorry, I've overshot my time.
Sure, so we are at 11:01 a.m. Tomáš, if you'd like a minute or so to respond before we move on to the after party, that would be good at this time.
That would be great. Thank you very much, Bob, for providing this perspective. If you, as I mentioned, really are at the origins of the random preference model, which I like also. And there is actually a quote, I think, in your paper where in terms of the interpretation of the random shock, you say that maybe it's individuals don't know really what they prefer, which I like as an interpretation, and that's why I refer to as imperfect self-knowledge. And the other one was that this apparent preference instability reflects, I think you said, myriad independent factors which influence preferences. And so I like this very much, and I think what I took away from it is that preferences indeed, the way people seem to use them for whatever reason, seem to be a distribution as opposed to just one parameter. And this parameter we estimated here, and I estimated in previous work for individuals, there seems to be large heterogeneity, and I linked it to conscientiousness, which again, I thought is not that inconsistent with a imperfect self-knowledge explanation, but there might be others. And maybe I'm clumsy with the true preference statement, which would go with this interpretation, but it might otherwise simply be the average preference that prevails in repeated elicitation. And what seems to me...
When the meaning about the conscientiousness, it seemed to me conscientiousness is a character trait, personality trait. It seemed not surprising to me that people, if there's the sort of person who's conscientious might well be the sort of person who has firmer ideas about their preferences. It's not that they, whereas I think it's not that they're conscientious, that they're willing to put in effort to retrieve their true preference. It's just that it's just a psychological feature of them, that they kind of feel more confident about what they prefer, and that the more laid back person is happy with many preferences and not to worry about it, you know?
Well, exactly. Actually, so in the previous research where I linked these structural parameters to personality traits and cognitive ability, I found that mistakes, which here we elaborated on and we basically made it into an effort model. Mistakes were related to cognitive ability, which would here be effort, whereas preference instability, which is the second stage error term, was related to conscientiousness. And what we find is that empirically, this effort probability or mistakes, they are more relevant in terms of explaining reduced form measures of choice inconsistency, such as reversals, the strong measures, whereas the preference instability estimated for individuals related to conscientiousness, that's related to more subtle forms of choice inconsistency, such as inconsistent switching points between the free groups of tasks in the MPL. And what I found, and why I talk about the true preferences, recognizing that there are multiple possible interpretations, is that once you look at these two designs, where the second one is closer to what you describe with using lotteries and random order, because I think what makes it more difficult is that the ordering is more difficult to perceive, actually, for individuals, is that once you correct for the inconsistency process, here especially the effort probability, then you obtain virtually identical distributions of the underlying latent preference using these two types of design.
That doesn't seem surprising to me, because it seems as though it's given the fact that the actual choice problems themselves are very, very similar. I mean, if you were to use different types of choice problems, I would expect you to find very different distributions of preference. But if your basic unit is a binary choice between well-specified lotteries, each lottery's got two positive consequences, then in a way you would expect that any method that used exactly the same type of lottery would tend to produce, on average, for any given person, the same kind of attitudes to risk, just because it's the same thing. But that doesn't seem to me to be the point. The point is this point of what's happening when you're giving people. Should you be giving people in an experimental sort of scientific experiment? Should you be giving people problems where one problem nudges you to how you should answer another one, and using consistency between? I took it. Are you treating each of the choices as an independent observation, effectively? Okay. Isn't that wrong in a sense? Because you're saying isn't it that to some extent there's really only one observation for each set of questions? If the method they use is to answer one question and then use that answer to determine the answer to the next one, consistency within them is not really an evidence of consistency. It's not consistency of preference. It's just the nudge you've put into your experimental design. You've nudged them to say, and give the same answer again. Give the same answer again.
Right. Well, I think this is very relevant for the HL design, and there's 3 groups of these HL tasks here. And within a design of HL, or within a group, people are, I think, aware that there is a pattern, and they might use this consistency heuristic, which you refer to. Now, consistency across the designs, it's unclear to me that they would be aware of the pattern that they should exhibit. And especially then when you go to the OLS design, which is another 5 groups, where this progression, even within a group, is less evident, then if you, just using, say, these 3 HL designs and 5 OLS, I'm correcting for this effort decision or the noise. You obtain different distributions. Putting in the effort model, the distributions converge. That to me suggests that maybe there is more to it. And now it might well be that if you look at risk taking in the real world with the stock market, maybe you get something different. However, or maybe that's my question to you. So what is your interpretation in the random preference model of this preference distribution that you obtain for an individual? What is that reflective of?
Well, my thought would be, I mean, this is only a conjecture, but my thought is being this is in a sense what people just don't have I mean, you don't, if you're given a problem, say, would you rather have £10 for sure or a 50% chance of £25? There is no right answer to that question. There's nothing in me that tells me what I should do. But on the other hand, it's clear that they're both reasonably sensible. And then if you have, there must be some range. If you said we should have £10 for sure or 50% chance of £1,000, it's pretty obvious. And so that you feel as though it's more like saying, well, there's certain preference. It's just that inside your natural senses, you just have a range of preferences, and there's no right answer. You just sort of feel that these are okay, and so that's what the random preference is. It's just the distribute. It's not that you have a true preference that you have to find, or that even you have a true preference in a given situation. Really, it's that you just have a fuzziness. Preference imprecision is what Graham calls it. Perhaps we should stop actually. Or perhaps I should stop.
Thank you.
The webinar is over, and so we're into the after party for discussion. So if anybody in the audience have questions, use the raise hand button, and we will click the raise hand button.
Hi, Jan, sorry to interrupt, but we're having trouble hearing you, actually. I think there might be something going on with your microphone.
Okay. Why don't you? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's quiet, but we can hear you.
We're into the party. So if you have a question, please raise hand button. And we have another webinar.
I had trouble hearing Yan, so I'll just repeat what she said in case other people also had the same trouble. So we are concluding the webinar and moving to after party, but we will continue the webinar series in August. So keep an eye out for our emails from Yan. And if you have any questions for either of the speakers, please either raise your hand or use the Q&A to ask your questions. Yes, Steve.
So I have a question to Thomas. I really like this paper and that you pick up on this problem of Anderson, who showed that you have to take into account the abilities of people to solve this sort of easy problem, because otherwise you might get a bias that you propose a structural estimation. I work here in a group where they do a lot of this cognitive modeling of this, that's how they call it, of these decisions, and your model looks fairly complex and with a lot of parameters, and I wonder how much you worried about parameter recovering and how much you, because it seems to me that some parameters could take over the effect from the others, and you don't have hundreds and hundreds of decisions, you're limited to 5 MPLs or so. So do you have something to say about this?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Steve. So first, there's 8 MPLs, but that is actually a small point with the 55 decisions. I think what gives us some degree of confidence that, again, these parameters are measuring what we would like them to is 2 things. One is that in counterfactual simulations, for example, I take the estimated parameters, I try to predict choices. They match observed choices approximately 90% of the time. This varies a little bit between the HL and OLS design just because of the noise content. And then another thing is that if you remove some of these parameters, because we tried it, right? So the bare bones model has a coefficient of risk aversion. It has an assumed form on utility on the error functions. And then it has the effort probability, which is really a mistake probability. And then it has the error term, which in the main model which we use is Bob's model, or at least drawing on that, the random preference model. And if we omit either the effort probability or the error term in the second stage, the estimated distributions of risk aversion, they don't change. Especially that's true on the HL design, right? On the OLS design, I showed they do change because, again, as you said, following Anderson et al.'s intuition, random errors, when unaccounted for, can produce biased estimates of preferences. So it does seem that once even if we go down to a bare bones model, the estimated distribution of risk preference, that doesn't change much. Once we expand this, these models or these parameters are behaving in expected ways. And notably, as I showed you in that last slide, the effort probability explains reversals. The coefficient of risk aversion explains choices very well on the HL design, less well on the OLS design. And what I didn't show, because of the shortness of time, is that the thing that the estimated preference inconsistency actually explains very well is inconsistent switching points between tasks, between the 3 groups of HL MPLs. Those aren't easy to construct for the OLS tasks as they don't have the same switch points, but the HL tasks do. under CRA utility. So that's what gives us some confidence that we are actually measuring what we hope to be measuring.
So I'm not sure whether you can hear me, but Ariane,
Yes.
Monsieur has a question. So if you unmute yourself, we should be able to hear you.
Hi, everyone. My question is actually more a suggestion than a question. I usually work with the risk apportionment methodology by Eckhart and Schlesinger to measure risk and high risk preferences. And I wonder if you would get similar results in terms of bias or, similar results with comparing to the HL or OLS when you use this methodology. This might be more than a suggestion than an actual question, but that might be something you might want to explore. And I'm happy to provide references and papers if you would like.
Okay, I would appreciate this, as I am not very familiar with the methodology. Unfortunately, what we do here is we look at CRA utility, we look at random preference, random utility, and we also look at mean variance utility, which is basically Apostego and Ballister show. That's a functional form of utility, which provides a monotone model of decision-making under risk, even when you tack on the error parameter as in random utility. And we find, so when we just look at the RPM or RUM with either CRA utility or mean variance, we find that the rank correlation of the estimates, it's above 0.9 for all three models.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Please do send me the reference.
I will.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, so I have a question about the switching. Can you hear me? Actually, I'm not sure whether that works. Okay. So Marina Agronoff has a paper where basically she models switching, the reversal in multiple price lists as indifference. You can type, there are different types of reversals, and there are certain types which you can say, well, subjects are switching back and forth because they're indifferent across these choices. How do you reconcile that with your model? Second question is that there are lots of different ways of implementing multiple choice. As Bob mentioned, we either give them as in the original Holt and Laurie fashion, right? So there's obviously a pattern, and that might induce a unique switching point. Or we show them in random order, one at a time. And it seems that in your model, the second method would imply higher effort. Is that what you get? So let's say, there are thousands of experiments which has the Holt and Laurie tagged on as if it's a survey almost. If you estimate these different data sets, do you get fairly consistent estimates across data sets on whether it's consistent with the intuition implied by your model?
Okay. So to your first point on choice indifference, we do not model that. My intuition would be that it could be responsible for some of this behavior, but I would personally be surprised if it's a major factor. Notably, if you look at, for example, the OLS design, where most of these reversals, just crudely measured, are concentrated, there's 25 tasks, and the implied points of indifference, CRA points of indifference, right? You assume CRA utility, the coefficient of risk aversion that an individual would need to have in order to be indifferent between the two tasks. They're basically different across all of them, apart from the first question where it's at 0 risk neutrality. And the reversals occur at basically across the lists. Therefore, for a given individual, if one of them were explained by indifference, the rest wouldn't be. So I would think this is a minor issue. However, we do not account for it specifically. Now to the second point, right. The second point was whether we would get the same distributions in different samples, right?
Right, and also the two ways of implementing the multiple price list, right? Either in sequence or random, in random order. Yeah.
So here, this is my intuition based on the results that we have here. I think by implementing the lotteries in random order, and that is what Bob was saying, I think, is that you get much more inconsistency. And I would argue, or I think our results give at least some credibility to the hypothesis that this might be due to differential effort costs perceived by individuals. Notably, if these decisions...
Why not say it's because you haven't given them given this nudge? I mean, you say you give them a set of tasks, and the tasks are in a set order, and so it's very obvious that that there should only be one switch point in a sense. So you think about this. If you think about them as a block, you can see there ought to be only one switch point. So therefore, that guides you to how to answer it. And then if you give them the questions in random order, then since there is no sense of a switch, so I think that the fact that if you give them in random order, you will get more reversals. It's obvious, in a sense it's obvious, but I don't think that's at all, I mean, it's possible that that's due to this sophisticated rationality or effort, but it seems much more just a simple heuristic, really. If you use a heuristic of saying, the sort of basic thought is, when given a choice, when given a problem, look for the easiest way of answering it. Scan around for different ways of thinking about it. It's like proving a theorem. You say prove a theorem, you think, well, what would be the easiest way of proving it? So you try that first. So if you give them a set of choice tasks which has a particular heuristic which would apply to it, then you'd expect them to use it. If this particular heuristic implies consistency with EU, then you will expect to find more consistency with EU. I mean, it's just a basic fact about heuristics, really. It's not. You seem to be going into very sophisticated explanations when they don't seem to be needed.
Well, if I understand correctly, what you're saying, basically individuals on the HL tasks, they would use some consistency heuristic, presumably in some way axed on their risk preference. Whereas on the OLS tasks, I think we're getting closer to these.
No, not that. No. What they do is you say, I answer one question. I mean, if I were given a multiple choice list now, knowing what a multiple choice list is, obviously you wouldn't begin with, but I would go to the middle and answer a question near the middle where you expect to be roughly indifferent. Then once you've done that, you can fill all the answers in straight away. Because you can, so you only need to answer two. If you've got a multiple choice list. I mean, we do that in our when we present these people those questions. What you do is you give them, when you tick one of these, which of these two do you prefer, and then when you tick one of them, it sort of fills in all the others above or all the others below. Yeah. And that's the best heuristic to use if you're trying to answer it. If you're trying to answer it with least effort, that's the heuristic. But the point is that heuristic automatically creates consistency, not with consistency with your underlying preferences, consistency with whatever question you answer first. Yeah. Because once you answer one question, you automatically know all the answers in one direction, don't you? Yeah. So when you fill those in, you end up. This is why I'm still not convinced that your tests are using independent observations, because it seems as though if the answer to one question implies the answer to the next, then consistency between them it's not an independent test of consistency. It's just a heuristic, I think. Sure.
So I think I agree with you in large part. And notably, I think if you take, that's what I was saying about the HL design, right? There's some clear choices at the beginning and the end, and there should be a switching point. And it does seem that this is doing sort of what people wanted to do. If you take that as one choice, and it's really 10, then the per choice effort task is really much lower. And then where I think our model comes into play, it's not with the HL design. There we just illustrate that, use our model, and the consistency parameters are sort of telling you what we think they should be, that people are making consistent choices here. The main point is that if you applied a similar reduced form analysis to the OLS design, you would get biased estimates. But then if you put our model in, then you obtain a distribution of risk preferences, which is very similar to that obtained to the less noisy HL set of elicitations. And those were to...
I think that's not, that's exactly what you should expect, because of the fact that the questions are, there's no real difference between the questions. If you say, what kinds of questions, what kind of individual questions go into one set, what go into the other, they're the same. They're the same type of question. So you would expect that they would elicit the same attitudes to risk, but with noise, obviously. But if you have if there's a heuristic that enables you, once you've answered one question, to give consistent answers to all the others, then obviously you're going to get more consistency. It seems so. And particularly when I think you were saying in your paper that with the Holt-Lowry design, actually the switch points were the same on each block, isn't it? Right? So if you were a rational person, you should switch at 0.4. You should switch at 0.4 on the next one, 0.4 on the next one. So in which case, again, you're giving another nudge to people to give the same answer on each of them, because you're saying, well, obviously people, some people bias towards the center of the scale, some people bias to the top, some people bias to the bottom. We all know that from contingent evaluation. So if you would expect some tendency for people to answer the same point on the scale across questions, irrespective of what the question was, there would be some tendency for them to do that, wouldn't there? So,
and that's precisely true on the HL design, not on the OLS design. And again, I agree with the point that you're making, that we would expect these to ultimately be reflective of some same underlying set of preferences or distributions of preferences, right? If we take the random preference model seriously. Now, I think my understanding is, and you have a much longer perspective on the history of the literature here, is that in previous research, this was not necessarily recognized. And some people use the HL design, some people the OLS design, often with reduced form measures, say they would count the number of risky choices people make, not recognizing the differential noise content in the two, and the fact that if you apply these reduced form techniques to both, one does yield, it seems to me, what I would call either estimates of true preferences or average preferences, whereas the other one reflects noise and biases your preference estimate.
That's the whole point. It doesn't, you see. That's the whole point. Seems to me that's your. I'm not saying it doesn't, but that's your conjecture. But I'm saying that it seems more plausible to think it's not the case. That it's not. It's true. It's a fact that there's less noise, in the sense less variation. If you say what on every, looking at the questions in a block, and you say what variation is there amongst the answers to the questions in the block, there's more variation in the Binswanger one than the Holt-Lowry one. That's the fact. But there's no reason, you're not entitled to infer from that one of them is a noisier picture of people's underlying distribution of preferences, because it's just saying that this one system, I mean, the Holt-Lowry one is tending to encourage people to give the same answers, or at least it could be doing. If you had suppose you said, think of the fact we know that if you give the same question twice to people in an experiment separated by other tasks, you'll get 30% of people will answer it differently. If on the other hand you put the two questions on the same page and said, now answer these two questions, you wouldn't get 30% reversals, because people would, you know, and if you said people would answer, once they answered one and the other one's exactly the same, almost all of them will give the same answer. But that, if you said, oh, that just goes to show this is a very good elicitation method, always give them 100 questions, identical questions on the same page, and then you get extremely consistent answers. But that's not the case. Well, it is the case, but it's not a way of eliciting consistent responses.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a way of eliciting consistency among their true preferences. It's just a way of eliciting consistent responses to questions on the page, you know.
I will let Bob have the last word. And thanks to the presenters and the discussants and everyone who participated. And we look forward to seeing everyone next week, next Wednesday. By all means, you know, carry out the arguments offline. But thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.